In 1908, a lighthouse keeper named Samuel Wickham sat down with a government inspector and said something that would be buried in maritime archives for over a century. He described watching a 2-ton glass lens float on liquid mercury like a feather on water, rotating with the touch of a single finger. He explained the precise measurements, the crystalline purity of the mercury, and the engineering tolerances that made it possible. And then he said something the inspector wrote down but never published. They told us this knowledge came from the old world, before the fires. 6 months later, the government ordered every mercury-bearing lighthouse in America to be decommissioned. The lenses were removed, the mercury was drained and disposed of, and men like Samuel Wickham were reassigned to newer, simpler technologies that required no such precision, no such knowledge, and no questions about where it came from. This is the story of the last lightkeeper who understood what it meant to float a Fresnel lens in 250 pounds of elemental mercury. And what he said about it might change everything you think you know about America's industrial age. If you're curious about the hidden mechanisms of the past and the knowledge that vanished with them, hit subscribe. I cover forgotten technologies and suppressed history every week. Now let's talk about what Samuel Wickham knew that the official record tried to erase. In the 1850s, American lighthouses began installing a technology so advanced, so precise, that modern engineers still struggle to replicate it under controlled laboratory conditions. They called it the Mercury Float Bearing System. A massive Fresnel lens, some weighing over 2 tons, would sit in a circular trough filled with liquid mercury. The lens would float, perfectly balanced, rotating on its axis with almost zero friction. A keeper could set the entire apparatus in motion with one hand. The official story says this was a French invention, brought to America during the lighthouse modernization program. Augustin Fresnel designed the lens. French engineers perfected the flotation system. American craftsmen learned to build them. Simple enough. But here's what they don't mention in the maritime museums or the engineering textbooks. The tolerances required to make this system work were beyond anything else being built in America at the time. We're talking about machining precision measured in thousandths of an inch, perfectly level surfaces across spans of 6 feet or more, mercury so pure that a single contaminating particle would throw off the balance, and construction techniques that required knowledge of thermal expansion, fluid dynamics and material science that supposedly didn't exist yet in American industry. Samuel Wickham started as an assistant keeper at the Navesink Light Station in New Jersey in 1886. The station had twin towers, both equipped with first-order Fresnel lenses floating on mercury bearings. Wickham was 22 years old, fresh from a childhood in New York where his father worked as a machinist in a factory that made precision instruments. He understood tolerances. He understood the difference between functional engineering and impossible engineering. And when he first saw the mercury bearing system, he knew something was wrong with the official story. The lens itself was a masterpiece. Hundreds of glass prisms assembled into a beehive-shaped structure that stood taller than a man. The Fresnel lens could project light from a simple oil lamp 20 miles out to sea. This part wasn't the mystery. The French had been making these since the 1820s. The mystery was the bearing system beneath it. The lens sat in a bronze chariot, a circular frame with wheels that rode in a trough machined into a cast-iron base. The trough was filled with mercury to a depth of 1 inch. When the lens was lowered into position, it floated. Actually floated, the same way a boat floats on water, except this boat weighed 4,000 pounds, and the water was liquid metal. Wickham spent his first year learning daily routines, fill the lamp with whale oil and later kerosene, trim the wicks, polish the glass, win the clockwork mechanism, and every week check the mercury. This is where things got strange. The mercury had to be pure. Not commercial purity, not scientific instrument purity, the kind of purity that required someone to understand molecular contamination and produce mercury so clean that modern labs would call it reagent grade. Wickham learned this from the head keeper, a man named Jacobson, who'd been tending lights since before the Civil War. Jacobson showed him how to test the mercury using a silver coin and glass slide, checking for contamination. If contaminated, you drained the bearing and refilled with fresh mercury from sealed containers that arrived from a supplier nobody talked about. "Where does the mercury come from?" Wickham asked. Jacobson looked at him for a long moment. "Government contract," he said. "Don't ask beyond that." But Wickham did ask. He started writing letters to the Lighthouse Board in Washington, to the Bureau of Standards, to engineering firms that supposedly manufactured lighthouse equipment. He wanted to know who was producing mercury this pure, how they were doing it, and why it was necessary in the first place. Most of his letters went unanswered. The ones that did come back said the same thing. The mercury was sourced from approved contractors under sealed bid contracts. The specifications were proprietary, and lighthouse keepers didn't need to know more than how to maintain the equipment. That was 1891. Wickham was 27 years old and starting to suspect that the lighthouse service was hiding something. The bearing system required maintenance that went far beyond checking mercury purity. The cast iron base had to be kept perfectly level. Not approximately, level. Not level enough for normal construction, perfectly level to within tolerances that required specialized surveying equipment that Wickham had never seen anywhere except at the lighthouse. Every 6 months, a team of engineers would arrive with this equipment. They'd set up instruments that looked like theodolites but more complex, with additional lenses and calibrated dials. They'd check the level of the base, make microscopic adjustments using jack screws set into the foundation, and then test the rotation of the lens. If the lens showed any wobble, any deviation from perfectly smooth rotation, they'd drain the mercury, inspect the trough under magnification, and make adjustments to the surface that Wickham couldn't see even with his naked eye. These engineers never talked about their work. They arrived, performed their tasks with quiet efficiency, and left. Wickham tried asking questions. Where did they learn to machine surfaces this precisely? What tools did they use? How did they measure tolerances this small? The lead engineer, a man named Morrison, finally responded after Wickham's 5th or 6th attempt. "You don't need to know that," Morrison said. "Your job is to keep the light burning. Our job is to keep the bearing working. Those are separate responsibilities." "But I want to understand the system," Wickham said. Morrison packed his instruments into their fitted case. "Then you want to understand something that took 100 men 100 years to figure out. You think you're going to learn that in a conversation?" "I think I'm going to learn that someone already figured it out a long time ago," Wickham said, "and someone else is pretending they invented it." Morrison stopped. He looked at Wickham with an expression that was part surprise, part something else. Respect, maybe, or concern. "You're smarter than you look," Morrison said, "which means you're smart enough to know when to stop asking questions." But Wickham didn't stop. He started keeping notes, detailed observations of the bearing system, the maintenance procedures, the specifications that seemed impossible for the 1890s, but would make perfect sense for a more advanced industrial civilization. He wrote down everything he could remember from conversations with the engineers, everything he could glean from the maintenance manuals that came with the equipment, every detail that suggested this technology didn't come from France in 1850. By 1898, he'd filled 3 notebooks with observations, and he'd started to notice something else. The mercury bearing systems were being phased out, not officially. There was no announcement, no new policy from the Lighthouse Board, but new lighthouses were being built with simpler rotation systems, ball bearings, roller bearings, technologies that didn't require mercury, didn't require impossible machining tolerances, and didn't require teams of specialized engineers to maintain. Existing mercury bearings were being replaced during routine maintenance. A station would report that the bearing had developed problems, engineers would arrive, and instead of repairing the mercury system, they'd install a ball bearing assembly. The mercury would be drained, supposedly sent back to the supplier, and the station would continue operating with the new, simpler system. Wickham asked Jacobson what was happening. Progress, Jacobson said. Ball bearings are easier to maintain, don't need mercury, don't need precision setup, cheaper to run. But they don't work as well, Wickham said. The mercury bearing has almost zero friction. You can rotate a 4,000-pound lens with one finger. The ball bearing system takes effort. You can feel the resistance. Jacobson shrugged. Still works well enough, and the board doesn't like mercury. Too expensive, too dangerous, too complicated. Since when does the government care about expensive? Wickham said. These lights are supposed to be the best technology available. Now they're replacing the best with good enough. That's what progress looks like sometimes, Jacobson said. Good enough becomes the new best when the old best costs too much. But Wickham thought there was more to it than cost. He thought someone had decided that lighthouse keepers shouldn't have access to technology this precise anymore. Someone had decided that the knowledge required to maintain these systems was too dangerous to leave in the hands of ordinary men who might start asking the wrong questions. In 1905, Wickham was promoted to head keeper at Navesink. Jacobson had retired. The new assistant keeper was a young man named Collins who'd never seen a mercury bearing in operation. Collins had been trained on the new ball bearing systems. He knew how to maintain a light, but he had no concept of the precision engineering that had made the mercury bearings possible. Wickham tried to explain it to him. He showed Collins the old bearing assembly, still installed in the North Tower. He demonstrated how the lens would rotate with the slightest touch, how the mercury absorbed vibrations and maintained perfect balance, how the entire system worked with a mechanical elegance that modern equipment couldn't match. Collins was impressed, but not curious. That's amazing, he said, but why does it matter? The ball bearings work. Because someone built this knowing things we've supposedly forgotten, Wickham said, and I want to know who and when and why we're pretending it never happened. Collins looked at him like he was talking nonsense. It happened in France, 1820, August and Fresnel. It's in all the books. The lens is in the books, Wickham said. The bearing system isn't. Go find me a book that explains how they machined those surfaces in 1820. Find me a book that explains how they produced reagent-grade mercury. Find me a book that explains any of this. Collins couldn't, because those books didn't exist. In January 1908, a government inspector arrived at Navesink. His name was Robert Hendricks, and he worked for a new agency called the Bureau of Lighthouse Engineering Standards. Hendricks had a clipboard, a camera, and a set of questions about the mercury bearing system that suggested he already knew the answers. Wickham spent 3 days showing Hendricks every detail of the bearing: the cast iron base with its machined trough, the bronze chariot and its precisely balanced wheels, the mercury reservoir, and the sealed containers of replacement mercury, the surveying equipment used to check the level, the maintenance logs that went back 20 years. Hendricks took photographs. He measured the trough dimensions. He tested the mercury purity using methods more sophisticated than the silver coin technique. He asked Wickham about the maintenance procedures, the engineer visits, the original installation, and then he asked the question Wickham had been waiting for. Where do you think this technology came from? Wickham looked at him. You want the official answer or the real answer? I want what you think. I think someone built this before 1850, Wickham said. I think they had industrial capabilities that exceeded anything we're told existed in that era. I think the Fresnel lens is real, but the bearing system came from somewhere else. And I think whoever built it didn't want us to remember they could do it. Hendricks wrote this down. Why not? Because it raises questions about what else they could do, Wickham said. Because if they could machine tolerances this precise, they could build other things, buildings, infrastructure, systems we're told didn't exist. And if those things existed, then the whole story about America's industrial development is wrong. Hendricks nodded. You ever hear the phrase, the old world? I've heard keepers use it, Wickham said. The older ones. They talk about equipment from the old world, techniques from the old world, knowledge that came before. Before what? Before the fires, Wickham said. That's what they say. Before the fires there was a different world, different capabilities, and then something happened, and most of it was lost. Hendricks closed his notebook. I'm going to include your observations in my report, but I'm going to recommend that this bearing be decommissioned, replaced with a standard ball bearing assembly. Why? Because the board has decided that Mercury bearings represent an unnecessary risk. Environmental hazard, maintenance complexity, training requirements, all valid reasons. But the real reason, Hendricks looked at him, the real reason is that men like you ask questions that the board doesn't want to answer, and the easiest way to stop the questions is to remove the evidence. The Mercury bearing at Navesink was decommissioned in April 1908. Wickham supervised the removal personally. The lens was lifted out of its chariot, the Mercury was drained into sealed containers and taken away by government contractors who wouldn't say where it was going. The cast iron base was broken up and removed. The bronze chariot was sent to a salvage yard. Wickham kept his notebooks. He kept the photographs Hendricks had taken, which the inspector had given him before leaving. He kept the maintenance logs and the specifications and every piece of documentation he could save before it disappeared into government storage. And he kept asking questions. In 1912, he wrote a letter to the Smithsonian Institution. He described the Mercury bearing systems, the precision engineering required to build them, and his belief that this technology represented knowledge from a previous era of American industry that had been deliberately obscured. He asked if the Smithsonian had any interest in preserving this history. The Smithsonian wrote back. They thanked him for his letter, but explained that the Mercury bearing systems were well documented in lighthouse engineering literature, represented straightforward applications of 19th century French technology, and didn't require any special historical preservation efforts. Wickham wrote to engineering journals, he wrote to historical societies, he wrote to anyone who might care that a technology requiring precision capabilities beyond the supposed limits of its era was being systematically erased from the American landscape. Nobody cared, or rather, nobody admitted they cared. But in 1915, Wickham received a letter from a man named Thomas Callaway. Callaway identified himself as an independent researcher studying pre-industrial American infrastructure. He'd heard about Wickham's inquiries through contacts at the Lighthouse Board. He wanted to know if Wickham would be willing to discuss his observations in more detail. They met at a tavern in New York. Callaway brought documents, photographs of buildings from the 1830s and 40s that showed construction techniques inconsistent with the tools supposedly available at the time. Surveys of infrastructure projects that required engineering knowledge that shouldn't have existed. Patents for machinery that described capabilities decades ahead of contemporary technology. "You're not crazy," Callaway said. "You've noticed what a lot of people have noticed, but most people ignore. There's a gap between what we're told was possible and what actually existed. The Mercury bearings are part of that gap." "So what fills the gap?" Wickham asked. "That's the question everyone's afraid to ask," Callaway said, "because the answer is either that we're wrong about our own history or someone's been lying about it." "Which do you think it is?" Callaway pulled out a photograph. It showed a city street circa 1860, buildings with architectural details that suggested advanced mathematical knowledge, street lamps with glass lenses that looked suspiciously like miniature Fresnel designs, infrastructure that seemed too organized, too planned, too sophisticated for a supposedly frontier nation. "I think America in the mid-1800s was more advanced than we remember," Callaway said. "I think there was knowledge, capability, and infrastructure that got destroyed or hidden. And I think the Mercury bearings are one of the few pieces of that world that survived long enough for people like you to notice." "Why would anyone hide it?" "Control," Callaway said. "If people knew what was possible, they'd ask why we don't have it anymore. They'd ask what happened. They'd ask who's responsible for the loss. Those are dangerous questions for people in power." Wickham never saw Callaway again after that meeting. He tried to follow up, sent letters to the address Callaway had provided, but they all came back undeliverable. It was like the man had never existed. Wickham retired from the Lighthouse service in 1923, By then, every Mercury bearing in America had been decommissioned. The last one, at Point Reyes in California, was removed in 1921. The technology that let you rotate a 4,000-pound lens with one finger was gone. Wickham spent his retirement writing. He compiled his notebooks into a manuscript he called The Lost Precision: Engineering Knowledge in the American Lighthouse Service. He documented every technical detail he could remember: the tolerances, the mercury purity, the maintenance procedures, the equipment that required capabilities supposedly beyond the era. He sent the manuscript to publishers. They all rejected it. Too technical, too narrow an audience, unverifiable claims. The real reason, Wickham suspected, was that nobody wanted to publish a book suggesting that American industrial history was incomplete or deliberately obscured. Wickham died in 1937. His manuscript was never published. His notebooks were donated to a maritime museum where they sat in storage for decades. The photographs Hendricks had given him disappeared into a private collection. The maintenance logs and specifications were lost when the Lighthouse Board's archives were consolidated and reorganized in the 1940s. For most of the 20th century, Samuel Wickham's observations about the mercury bearing systems were forgotten. Lighthouse historians mentioned the bearings as interesting technical footnotes. Engineering books described them as examples of 19th century precision manufacturing. Nobody asked the questions Wickham had asked, but in 2006, a researcher named Elizabeth Cormier was doing archival work at the Maritime Museum that held Wickham's notebooks. She was studying lighthouse technology for a dissertation on industrial knowledge transfer. She opened one of Wickham's notebooks and started reading his technical descriptions, and she realized something was wrong. The tolerances Wickham described couldn't be achieved with 1850s technology. The mercury purity levels required industrial chemistry that didn't exist commercially until the 1920s. The surveying equipment needed to level the bearing bases to those specifications wasn't standard issue until after World War II. Cormier spent 2 years tracking down every surviving piece of evidence about the mercury bearing systems. She found photographs of the bearings in government archives. She found maintenance records that confirmed Wickham's descriptions. She found patent applications for the bearing assemblies that showed engineering drawings with specifications that seemed impossible for their era. And she found something else. In the records of the Bureau of Lighthouse Engineering Standards, there was a memo dated April 1908. It recommended the immediate decommissioning of all mercury bearing systems and their replacement with simpler technologies. The stated reason was environmental and safety concerns, but attached to that memo was a handwritten note. Knowledge retention risk. Recommend removal before widespread documentation occurs. Someone in the government in 1908 had decided that lighthouse keepers knowing how to maintain precision engineering systems was a risk, not a safety risk, a knowledge risk. Cormier published her findings in 2009. The Mercury Bearing Mystery: Lost Precision in American Lighthouse Engineering. The paper documented everything Wickham had observed, confirmed his technical descriptions, and raised the question he'd spent his life asking: where did this technology really come from? The paper was published in a specialized engineering history journal. It got minimal attention, a few footnotes in subsequent lighthouse histories, no major media coverage, no follow-up investigations, but people noticed. Researchers working on other aspects of 19th century American infrastructure started finding similar patterns. Buildings that required advanced mathematical knowledge, bridges that showed sophisticated engineering beyond the supposed capabilities of their builders, manufacturing equipment with precision tolerances that shouldn't have been possible. The picture that emerged was of an America in the mid-1800s that was far more technologically sophisticated than the standard narrative suggested. Not science fiction advanced, not impossible, just consistently more capable, more organized, more precise than we're told. And then something happened. The 1860s and 70s saw massive fires in American cities: Chicago, Boston, New York, Portland. Fires that destroyed not just buildings but entire neighborhoods of infrastructure. Fires that were followed by rebuilding efforts that used simpler technologies, less precise construction, more standardized and less sophisticated systems. After the fires, America's industrial development followed the trajectory we learn in textbooks. Gradual advancement, steady progress, new technologies building on old foundations. But what if the foundations weren't new? What if the fires destroyed something that was already more advanced than what came after? And what if people like Samuel Wickham noticed the gap and spent their lives trying to tell anyone who'd listen? The Mercury bearing systems were real. The engineering tolerances were real. The precision was real. These aren't controversial claims. They're documented in government records, engineering specifications, and maintenance logs. What's controversial is the implication. If this level of precision existed in the 1850s, what else existed? What other capabilities were lost or hidden? And why does the official narrative skip over this gap as if it never happened? Samuel Wickham died believing he'd failed. He couldn't convince anyone that the Mercury bearings represented something larger than a technical footnote. He couldn't get his manuscript published. He couldn't preserve the knowledge he'd spent decades acquiring. But he left a record, and eventually someone found it. And that record raises questions that still don't have answers. Where did the precision come from? Who taught the engineers who built those bearing systems? Why were they decommissioned so quickly? Why did the government want to remove them before lighthouse keepers could document them thoroughly? And what happened to the knowledge that made them possible? These aren't questions about conspiracy theories or alternative history. These are questions about documented engineering capabilities that existed, were systematically removed, and then forgotten. The Mercury bearings are gone. The last surviving example sits in a museum, drained and inert. You can't rotate it with one finger anymore. You can't watch 2 tons of glass float on liquid metal. You can't experience the mechanical elegance that Samuel Wickham described, but you can read his notebooks. You can study the engineering specifications. You can look at the photographs and the maintenance records and the patent applications, and you can ask yourself the same question Wickham asked for 40 years. If they could build this in 1850, what else are we missing about the past? That's the story of the last lighthouse keeper who understood the Mercury bearing systems, not a story about lost technology from an ancient civilization. A story about documented precision engineering from less than 200 years ago that doesn't fit the narrative we're taught. A story about knowledge that was deliberately removed and systematically forgotten. A story about one man who noticed the gap and spent his life trying to make someone care. The question isn't whether Samuel Wickham was right about where the technology came from. The question is why nobody wanted to find out.